Hello, my friends, Evolutionary Energy Arts family. So, guys, we're looking at Venus. And Venus is really a very unusual planet. And we've been talking about all these discoveries that have been coming in lately that are pointing to, they're pointing perhaps a lot to the fact that perhaps the ancient tales and legends and things that have been handed down throughout our history have a lot more of the truth in them than what mainstream science has thought is the truth. And we've been getting a lot of different things. They've talked about Planet 9, the evidence for Planet 9, and some will say that that is Nibiru or Nemesis. And there is more and more evidence, even to the fact that they say that it's a very extremely likely probability. Something almost has to be out there. So they keep leaking these little things to us slowly and surely. And this is out of NASA, of course, never a straight answer. So what scientists found after sifting through the dust in the solar system. And so we have to sift through the dusty words of NASA themselves, because we know they're not giving us always straight answers. And a lot of times they're hiding things, but it feels like there's a little bit of disclosure going on. Perhaps it's a forced disclosure. I will, look forward to your opinions and comments on that. So they've done studies, and they did studies on the dust rings. There's dust, well, as it says here, just as dust gathers in corners and along bookshelves in our home, dust piles up in space too. But when the dust settles in the solar system, it's often in rings. Several dust rings circle the sun. Rings trace the orbit of planets whose gravity tugs dust into place around the sun as it drifts by on its merry way around the center of the solar system. The dust is basically consists of crushed up remains from the formation of the solar system. They're saying 4.6 billion years ago, and who knows? Who really knows? We don't know because we can't trust them, unfortunately. But as always, we need to discern for ourselves. Rubble from asteroid collisions or crumbs from blazing comets. Always look at all the words that they say. Dust is dispersed throughout the entire solar system, but it collects at grainy rings overlying the orbits of Earth and Venus. Rings that can be seen with telescopes on Earth. By studying this dust and what it's made of, where it comes from, how it moves through space, scientists seek clues to understanding the birth of planets and the composition of all that we see in the solar system. And so 2 recent studies report new discoveries of dust rings in the inner solar system. One study uses NASA data to outline evidence for a dust ring around the Sun at Mercury's orbit. And a second study from NASA identifies the likely source of a dust ring at Venus's orbit. A group of never-before-detected asteroids orbiting the planet. It's not every day you get to discover something new in the inner solar system, said Mark Kuchner, the author on the Venus study and astrophysicist at NASA Goddard's Space Flight Center. This is right in our neighborhood. Okay, so it goes into some details. I'll have the links for you guys, as always. But the thing to cut to the chase is Venus's dust ring doesn't make sense. It does not compute. It doesn't give us the answers that we would want to have if everything was consistent in the solar system with mainstream thought. So the scientists couldn't call it a day after finding a hypothetical solution that worked and figuring out why is the ring around Venus so dense and have so many asteroids and have so much material. We thought we discovered this population of asteroids, but then we had to prove it, show it works. We got excited, but then you realize, there's so much work to do. They needed to show that the very existence of the asteroids makes sense in the solar system. It would be unlikely they realized that the asteroids in these special circular orbits near Venus arrived there from somewhere else, like the Asteroid Belt. At least that's what they thought. How could it get there? How could these asteroids get from where the Asteroid Belt is, which is on the other side of the Earth, You have Mercury closest to the sun, Venus is next, the Earth, and then, after that you have Mars and the Asteroid Belt. And Venus and Earth are almost identical sizes. So how could you get the material that's on the other side of Mars, which is on the other side of Earth, over to Venus? It didn't make any sense. And you know what? It still doesn't make any sense to them. They really haven't figured it out. And yet, right off the bat, and I watched this, I watched Ben from Suspicious Observers talk about this a couple days ago. And or maybe it was even yesterday morning, but it just clicked with me automatically that it took me straight to Velikovsky. And, just so you guys know, there's a lot of weird oddities to Venus, and this is a photo of Venus from Galileo. And, one of the odd things is the Venusian volcanoes. There are more volcanoes on Venus than any other planet in the solar system. Astronomers know of more than 1,600 volcanoes on its surface, but there are likely many more too small for us to see. And already we know there's more there than anywhere else, and we have not even seen or detected all of them. In Venus, the day is longer than the year. Is that crazy? A day on Venus lasts 243 Earth days. That's how long it takes for Venus to make one rotation. On Earth, obviously, we got 24 hours to make a rotation, and we have 365 days rounded off to make a year here. And a year on Venus, with its revolution around the sun, is shorter at 224.7 Earth days. So 243 days to make one revolution, 224.7 to make its path around the sun. So that's an oddity. And obviously Earth's twin, they're almost identical in size. Almost. And the orbit of Venus is also the closest to Earth. It's closer to Earth than Mars. Now, the circumstances between the two planets are very different. Would you expect them to be so different when they're that relatively close? Yes, Venus is closer to the sun, but when they actually went and measured it and were able to measure its temperature and its composition and everything, it surprised them because they didn't expect it to be the way it is. But because of the bulk of its atmosphere is made up of carbon dioxide, an extreme greenhouse effect is what they think mainstream-wise, is making the warming the surface of Venus. Temperatures can reach 870 degrees Fahrenheit. The surface is hot enough to melt lead due to its runaway greenhouse atmosphere. And that comes from NASA too. So the air pressure on the surface of Venus is extreme. It's about 90 times higher than the pressure at sea level on Earth. In other words, the pressure on Venus is about the same as the water pressure on Earth, about a half a mile under the ocean. Venus we do see cross the sun because it's in closer to the sun. So only in Venus and Mercury we get to really watch this happen. Venus is the brightest planet because of position and relativity to the sun. And so Venus, has been talked about in so many different historical traditions. But that itself, too, is very interesting. And we're going to look a little bit deeper into that in a moment. So it's a very windy planet. Winds swipe across Venus at super fast speeds that can reach 450 miles an hour. That's huge. And because Venus orbits the sun within Earth's orbit, the planet appears to have phases like the moon. So when Venus is on the opposite side of the sun, it's in full phase. When it appears in its new phase is when it's between the Earth and the sun. And Galileo was the first person to witness that. So very interesting facts. And as I said, immediately when I heard about the dust and how they were having a problem explaining the dust and the asteroids, I thought of Velikovsky. And so Emanuel Velikovsky was ridiculed by mainstream for the most part. And he argued famously, based on his own interpretation of ancient sources, that Venus had emerged from Jupiter as a comet. It interacted with the Earth and Mars in the second and first millennia BC and then finally settled into a nearly circular orbit of the Sun. 4 new lines of reasoning support a revised and enhanced version of this theory. First, instead of the various unpersuasive suggestions that Velikovsky and others have made for how a cometary Venus could have emerged from Jupiter, we should consider the possible consequences of the immense gravitational field of Jupiter, which pulls into the giant planet a stream of asteroids and comets, such as Shoemaker-Levy in 1994. That was a spectacular sight. I remember that really well. A plausible scenario would have been an initially dark, cold proto-Venus pulled by Jupiter's gravity from the outer solar system shortly before 2500 BC, passed close enough to Jupiter yet managed to escape its gravitational field. We can term this the peripheral passage of Jupiter by Venus, and we can assume that extreme tidal forces from Jupiter's gravitational field caused tremendous heating and great cometary tail visible to observers on Earth. This would account for the curious stories of the ancient Greeks that Athena, Venus, eventually Aphrodite, replacing Athena in this role, was born from the head of Zeus, Jupiter, and of the ancient Hindus that Shukra, Venus, emerged from the mouth of Shiva. According to Greek myth, Zeus turned pregnant Metis into a fly who zipped into his mouth. She gave birth to Athena inside of him, and then Athena emerged from his head on the opposite side of his mouth. In effect, Greek observers spotted Proto-Venus while it was approaching Jupiter as tidal friction heated it up until incandescence, and the Greeks called it Metis. We also know that Athena was originally Athena, the Phoenician, referring to the brilliant comet rising in the east. So too, the Roman Venus, evidently originally Phenis, the Phoenician. Velikovsky misinterpreted the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus myth to mean that Venus had been explosively expelled from Jupiter itself. His scientific critics rightly considered that bizarre and unacceptable, so his reputation suffered and his other valuable contributions were ignored. So Proto-Venus would have been large and dense enough to maintain its integrity and the gravitational and magnetic fields of Jupiter, even though the entire planet would have become molten. This Venus would possess a set of elements different from those of Jupiter itself. This scenario would also resolve the paradox that Venus is old, and yet its surface features appear young. So again, it doesn't make any sense when you look at Venus and when you look at the model that all the planets formed at the same time and in their current places. It just doesn't work in the standard model. And so something has gone on here. And it's fascinating because, of course, many view Venus as the morning star. Many view Venus as Lucifer as well. There's all these different backdrops to it and a black drop to it as well. And so it's fascinating to really go into this. Second, the black drop observed during the transits of Venus across the solar disk appears to be the residual tail of a comet/planet. On ingress from the solar limb, the black drop stretches out behind Venus. On egress, it appears in front of the planet. During transit, it's not visible. A residual comet's tail on Venus would be shifted by the solar wind from trailing the planet at ingress to standing away from the sun during transit. Thus only the disk of Venus would appear, and finally to preceding the planet at egress. So it's another curiosity. There's all these curiosities, and then we start looking at the evidence that we see in the ancients. And so, although present-day Venus is very spheroidal, its center of mass is displaced from the center of a figure by 280 meters in a way that it appears to have been the result of tidal locking during the peripheral passage of Jupiter. So in ancient times, Venus was depicted as ovoid. For example, in Ohio's Great Serpent Mound, and a depiction of Egyptian goddess Sekhmet over here to the left. So this striking shape can readily be explained as a consequence of the pull of Jupiter's gravity on the passing molten Venus during tidal locking. The comet planet eventually came close to being torn in two, the anomalous, very slow retrograde rotation of Venus, which, however, is rapidly shifting towards prograde, can likewise be powerfully explained as a result of tidal locking to Jupiter. And here again, you see the different disks, and one of Venus and one of another planet here. And it's fascinating. It really is fascinating to look at all these things. And there's more. So, this is on the discoveries recently that we've had concerning Jupiter and Venus. In light of the recent discoveries of radio waves from Jupiter and the high surface temperature of Venus, we think it proper and just to make the following statements. So on the 14th of October in 1953, Emanuel Velikovsky, addressing the Forum of Graduate College at Princeton University in a lecture entitled Worlds in Collision, in the light of recent finds in archaeology, geology, and astronomy, refuted or verified, concluded the lecture as follows. The planet Jupiter is cold, yet its gases are in motion. It appears probable to me that it sends out radio noises, as do the sun and the stars. I suggest this to be investigated. Soon after that date, the text of the lecture was deposited with each of us, as is printed as supplement to Velikovsky's Earth in Upheaval. 8 months later, in June 1954, Velikovsky, in a letter, requested Einstein to use his influence to have Jupiter surveyed for radio emissions. The letter with Einstein's marginal notes commenting on this proposal is before us. 10 more months passed. And on the 5th of April 1955, B.F. Burke and K.L. Franklin of the Carnegie Institution announced the chance detection of strong radio signals emanating from Jupiter. So they recorded the signals for several weeks before they correctly identified the source. And so that discovery came as something of a surprise, because radio astronomers had never expected a body as cold as Jupiter to emit radio waves. But Velikovsky was right. And then also they talk about the existence of a radiation belt encompassing Jupiter, giving it 10 to the 14th power times as much radio energy as the Van Allen belts around the Earth. And so he had a lot of things that were confirmed in time. And actually, a lot of the stuff we're getting just now is really pointing in the direction that Velikovsky was he might have gleaned more of the truth than people know. And maybe it's not perfect, and maybe there are some things that he didn't get quite right. But the general gist looks more likely every day as we learn more and more. And so this is fascinating. Again, I got all the links for you. And so, one of the things he didn't buy is that the position of the planets have been this way for millions and billions of years. He didn't buy that at all. And he thought that there were great cataclysms that happened really pretty recently in the big scheme of things. And he also, viewed the fact that, there's evidence of great cataclysms that have gone on. Great cataclysms. He also, believed in crustal displacement along with Hapgood. So, when you have pole shifts, you're going to have huge tidal waves and tremendous earth changes. And, of course, that was not necessarily the case of mainstream. And as these new discoveries keep coming out, he's getting pretty verified, one step at a time, at least in many ways. So in his scheme, Venus took the form of a huge rogue comet after being ejected by Jupiter not long before 1500 BC. It hurtled sunward, sideswiping Earth twice and then colliding with Mars before settling into the almost perfectly circular orbit it now occupies. And so, he went deep into all the old narratives, the Old Testament narratives, cosmological myths coming from China, Central America, India, Assyria, and elsewhere. And this is the thing. If you're just looking at one tradition, if we were just taking just the Bible and biblical traditions, it's one thing, because you say, well, maybe it's localized. Maybe it's something that people in just one small part of the planet had experienced. And, we're not talking, it being a global phenomenon and things that people everywhere notice, but that's not the case. Because we have the same myths from China, Central America, India, Assyria, and other places as well. And so what got him starting to think was the biblical story of Joshua commanding the sun and the moon to stop moving for an entire day, and invoking a devastating hail of stones from the sky during his battle with the Amorites. And he even also was seeking a physical reason for the plagues inflicted on the Egyptians in the Exodus. And so this provided all the answers for him. And what was also interesting, and it says here, as further proof, he details how Venus is conspicuously absent from various historical tabulations of the planets prior to 2000 BC. And Venus, we just said, it's the most visible, other than the moon, and the night sky, it is the most visible thing up there. Why wasn't it not documented prior to 2000 BC? Very interesting. But you know what? Also, there's myths, and I've covered this in videos from about a year ago. There's myths that come from indigenous people in multiple locations around the world that also remember a time when the moon wasn't there, that the moon was placed there or came there, not when the earth was created, but after. So it's very, very interesting stuff. And talking about that crustal displacement, Velikovsky believed the Earth's crust displacement is connected with a stop for a few days of the Earth's diurnal rotation. Velikovsky found historical descriptions of a prolongation of the day or night in connection with the great cataclysms from Egypt, the Colbrin, Mexico, the annals of Cuauhtitlán and Popol Vuh, and in China, Book 5 of the Mosey. The period for these events was around 1500 BC. Velikovsky reached the conclusion that an Earth crust displacement is the only possible explanation for several incredibly severe geological, climatological, paleontological discoveries and facts that must have been cataclysmically triggered. How did the Himalayas, the Alps, and the Andes, which were once below the oceans, rise and reach their present heights? So it's fascinating. There are periods of very dramatic mountain building, and that happened around 9500 BC all over the world. This does not mean that the present mountain ranges were created from scratch at that time, but that the mountain ranges then were given a huge lift from 1 to 4 kilometers and reached their present heights. The Alps may have been given a lift of no less than 4 kilometers, and they were moved 100 to 600 kilometers northward. What could cause something like that? So we have other legends too. Of course, we know the legend of Nibiru. And, at first it might sound like it has nothing to do with it, but perhaps it does. It's pretty fascinating. So according to the Nibiru and the Sumerian legends, the Earth was created out of another planet. And that planet was Tiamat. And that planet was in the orbit where the asteroid belt is now. And when Nibiru came in, it basically destroyed, it split it in half. It created the asteroid belt, and then what was left became Earth in a different location. And so there is evidence to this. There is. And it's fascinating to look at this. So according to the harmonic rule known as Bode's law, a planet should exist between Mars and Jupiter, some 260 million miles from the Sun. And beginning in 1801, tiny rock and metallic objects were discovered to be orbiting the Sun. at about this distance. Since then, several 100,000 large asteroids have been cataloged, and it's estimated that there are more than 1 million 1-kilometer asteroids. Stretched out at a distance of 205 to 300 million miles from the Sun, this band is known as the Asteroid Belt. And the asteroids range in size from Ceres, which has a diameter of about 1,000 kilometers, down to the size of pebbles. If the estimated total mass of all the asteroids was gathered into a single object, this object would total about 1,500 kilometers, 932 miles across, less than half the diameter of the Earth's moon. So this is fascinating stuff. And so what really happened? Sitchin believes that Tiamat isn't missing, it just moved shop. And that the Earth is what Tiamat was. And of course the Earth is much smaller, but then we have the asteroids, and the asteroid belt is part of the leftover, and the Earth is the rest. So it's fascinating, and if you haven't read the Sumerian books, they're a great read. They're very interesting. You can't put them down. So this article is all about the two anomalies that suggest the Earth was once further away from the Sun, suggesting that prior to a great cataclysm described in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, which is thousands of years older than our Hebrew Bible, the Earth was the planet which the Sumerians called Tiamat. According to Sumerian Babylonian cosmology, the fifth planet from the Sun, Tiamat, was shunted to third position by a calamitous event, and one that is well known now by followers of Planet X theory. And so ancient Sumerian texts indicate that Tiamat was struck by a large planet which moved into its present orbit and also created the Earth's moon and the asteroid belt. And so the planet, which was renamed Marduk, because originally it was Nibiru, but then Marduk usurped all the power of everything and had it named after himself. And Marduk is the son of Enki, one of the sons of Enki, Ea, of who we have Earth, right? And it's just fascinating to go through these stories. And as I said, they read so easy and they read good. And many people don't believe in them. They think it's total propaganda. And that Sitchin was a 33rd degree Mason, which again, things get leaked to us, whether he was or wasn't. There are truths in here, and there's more people than just Sitchin who have translated these texts, and they're not in disagreement as far as what these texts say. So basically, the remaining half of the planet, which was struck by a smaller moon of Marduk, was catapulted into a new orbit along with chunks of material which became its moon. According to the Enuma Elish, Tiamat's original moons were dispersed, many changing the directions of the orbits and rotation. And there is indeed evidence of this great cataclysm in the solar system today. So Tom Van Flandern, a specialist in celestial mechanics at the U.S. Naval Observatory, has suggested that the Great Rift on Mars may be the impact site of a former moon. The moons of Neptune show evidence of violent disruption. Mercury was originally a moon of Venus. Mars once had many more moons, and Pluto and Charon are escape moons of Neptune. Van Flandern finds the retrograde rotation of Venus particular. I mean, why would it not be? He believes there are moon originated from the Pacific basin of the Earth, and he agrees that there is probably an undiscovered planet beyond Pluto, which belongs to our solar system. In addition, Hubble recently investigated one of the largest asteroids, Vesta, which is right above this right here, and found evidence of differentiated layers similar to the terrestrial planets, distinctive light and dark areas like the face of our moon, and a geology very similar to Earth, including evidence of ancient lava flows. So, of course, Sitchin believes that the impossible knowledge of the Sumerians was given to them by the Anunnaki, and so the Anunnaki are the quote-unquote gods, really just simply other beings, and the belief there is that humanity was modified by the Anunnaki thus, creating us in their image or recreating us from what was already here. And there's so much to talk about when it comes to that. Very interesting stuff. And, there is knowledge, and there's knowledge, too, in the Vedic traditions. Do you know in the Vedic traditions, thousands of years ago, they knew the shape and the span of the Milky Way galaxy? How could they know that? How could they possibly know it? The only thing I would say is perhaps they knew it by going within in deep meditation and getting truths, or they were given the knowledge by superior technologically advanced beings, or it was leftover knowledge of our own from perhaps higher civilizations. All interesting thoughts, and I want to hear what you guys think on all this. So there's so many mathematical irregularities in the orbits of the planets. We've talked about this before. There is something happened. It's just plain and simple. Something happened. What do you guys think? And here we see a little diagram, and it basically is showing different positions of the planets, Pluto and Neptune and Saturn and all, and how this other one could come in. Now, whether Venus was actually Nibiru's moon or whatever, maybe it was something that was rogue, that was captured and brought in with it and sent off like a bowling ball through the pins. That's all points for conjecture, but it's all pretty damn interesting when you think about it. And with the evidence that there was great cataclysms on Earth, and we see what's happening around us now. So the thought of Tiamat becoming Earth after a huge cataclysm, you would think that a long period of time would have to pass, for the Earth to basically take form from Tiamat into such a beautiful sphere and full of life and everything. Well, a couple of things come to mind. One is, was it terraformed? And you know what? When we look at the Bible, too, and look at the original creation, and the very, very first words out of the Bible, it's interesting because it talks about creation, and then it says, and the earth was void and without form. So it almost gives you the idea that it was recreated, and or reworked or terraformed, however you want to talk about it. And so when I think about that, I can't shake it out of my head, the movie Dark City. And in Dark City, what is the case that we don't find to the end is that these people think they're living on a city, on a planet, but in reality, it's basically just a mothership. And and it's a mothership facing away from the sun, controlled by these beings that are humanoid looking, but they're really not humans at all. They are, you might call them aliens. We are not given a great explanation on them. There's basically these beings are inhabiting the dead bodies of humans and animating them, but they're not human at all. But they are conducting experiments that lead humans to have amnesia and not recognize who they are, where they are, or anything. And they do experiments, and they're testing humans because they want to figure out what makes humans work and what makes the human soul or spirit unique, because they are unique. So they put them asleep every night, and they change their situation. And in one segment, they take this poor couple that don't have anything, no food, and they're on a rickety little table about to eat some crumbs, and they change their whole scenario and stick them in a big mansion with servants, with luxury and abundance, to see how they'll react, to see how they will react. And will all humans react the same way? If not, what makes each human different? What is it that makes everyone different? And so when I saw that, it made me think of Gnosticism and the archons, and that whole thing, as well as, of course, extraterrestrials and many other legends as well. And, one thing of note is that they don't like the light, and that they always keep it dark, facing away from the sun. And so it's just one of those scenarios as we all think about how many dark days we have now with nothing but chemtrailed skies, and we don't get to see the sun as much. All the rain that's constantly coming down, and we're told it's a grand solar minimum. It's just what happens. Get used to it. All the volcanoes are going off. It's gonna be like Gotham of New York, or it's gonna be like the Dark City movie. And then this, of course, gets into the Matrix too, because the lead character here discovers that he's got the power to change things. And so the aliens have psychic powers. These other beings have psychic powers. And then they discover that this one human has these psychic powers too, and is able to do everything they can do. And it kind of reminds me of the Matrix, with Neo being able to do all the things that the agents, quote unquote, the computer programs that are the agents, can do, and then even more, because it's latent in humans. It's abilities in humans that are dormant. And they don't want this getting out, and he is the biggest threat to them, just as us waking up is the biggest threat to the system. So it's pretty fascinating, and the movie ends with him defeating all the extraterrestrials, taking control of the mothership, and turning it facing the sun, and creating a beautiful paradise, a new heaven and a new earth, as all our legends seem to talk about. Whether we're talking Bible, Hopi, or Mayan, whatever legends they are, they're all talking about the same thing, the Australian Aborigines. Ultimately, it's a new, beautiful planet that we emerge out into. And it's a matter of us recognizing our abilities, our potential, who we really are, because that who we really are has been kept from us. And our potential has been kept from us as well. And we are discovering these things in little dribs and drabs, but many of you know deep down inside the inherent truth. So as always, my friends, thumbs up to support the channel. Please do subscribe, click the bell, get all the notifications, and share with as many as possible. I look forward to your comments and your thoughts. God bless, and namaste.